Hello, I'm Jake Boudrot, Civic Journalist at Telile Community Television. In this episode of Strait Talk, Telile recorded a presentation that took place on November 3rd at St. John's Centre for the Arts in Arichat by Dr. Donald L. Forbes on coastal erosion and rising sea levels. After the presentation, Dr. Forbes answered my questions. Dr. Forbes is a former research scientist emeritus with the Geological Survey of Canada at the Bedford Institute of Oceanography. Dr. Forbes is also Canada's past vice chair with Future Earth Coasts. During his career in marine geoscience, his focus gradually shifted to coastal hazard reduction and sustainability in coastal communities.
It's always a pleasure to come to Arichat. I first came here a few years ago at the instigation of Dan Lane, who unfortunately isn't in town these days. They've gone to visit grandchildren in Ontario. But it was Dan who proposed Île Madame as one of 6 communities in a project called Sea Change, which was looking at climate change adaptation and rising sea levels in coastal communities in Canada and the Caribbean. So we had 3 communities in Canada. Île Madame was one of them. The other 2 were Iqaluit and BC. I'm sorry, I'm blanking. And then we had 3 in the Caribbean: 1 in Guyana, 1 in Trinidad, and 1 in Bequia in the Grenadines. My involvement was, I was just about at the point of retirement, and my involvement in the Île Madame work was not extensive, but I think we know enough to be able to say something useful.
How much information from that study did you have to draw from for some of the information you provided?
Well, some of it was work that we did then. The work on flooding of roads is something that was one of the components that we worked on with Sea Change. Sea Change also was involved in looking at I think issues around infrastructure in Arichat. We looked into Little Ants, where the storm had damaged the wharf there, and ways of making people more secure in events like that, finding ways of communicating between people so that people that might be isolated by water could be reached. There was a whole host of activities that were involved in that. So much of what I was presenting was based on earlier work that we had done in similar areas, for example, on the eastern shore of Nova Scotia, where it's a very similar shoreline, and we'd learned about some of the processes that operate. We could apply that in Île Madame. The blue shading shows the high tide limit in 1998. So you can see that no one would put a mooring ring at that elevation if the tide came that much higher. And then there are many places around Nova Scotia and PEI where we see rooted stumps in the shoreline. It's evident that the forest used to extend further seaward, and now the waters come in. So there are other things that drive coastal change, and these include groundwater, seepage, and in some places freeze thaw. So if you have a clay cliff and you get a lot of freeze thaw, that can actually be a cause of erosion. On the north shore of the St. Lawrence estuary, they find that that's a really significant driver. And then the soil, the cliff stability is a function of slope stability. So there are all kinds of geotechnical components that influence whether or not you'll have failure, which will bring sediment down into the wave zone where it can be washed away. And to keep the cliff eroding, you actually have to have the energy to move that sediment away. And then all kinds of things related to fluid dynamics. So wind and waves. And wave transformation as it comes into the shoreline. So it shoals, it steepens, and then eventually will break, and you could have run up that will wash over the beach. Um, tidal inlet processes that can influence the beach some distance away from the inlet. And I mentioned tsunami there. I actually would be very intrigued if people have stories of the 1929 tsunami in Ile-Madame. But it was a damaging event, particularly in Newfoundland. And although it's rare, there is a finite probability, a very, very small finite probability. Your chances of being hit by lightning are probably much higher. But nevertheless, we need to be aware of that. So these drivers, they interact with the landscape, the geology, with the sediments, the landforms, the marshes, and even the infrastructure that we build, and they erode and they move and they deposit sediment in other places, and that causes a morphological change. This was actually taken during Hurricane Hortense back in the mid-90s, showing a beach that was being overtopped. And this beach actually never recovered. So all of these processes interacting gave us Ile-Madame as it is today. This is actually a diagram by Eric Force, who used to live here. He was a professor at the University of Arizona, I think, working with Sandra Barr from Acadia. And it's, I think, the most up-to-date map of the geology of Ile-Madame. And you can see, first of all, that there's a sort of west-southwest to east-northeast orientation of the rocks. And so some of the topography is a function of that orientation. The other thing that's fairly obvious, I think, is that all of those solid lines and even the heavy dashed lines are faults. So cracks in the rock where rocks shifted. And you can see that, for example, is this going to work? The alignment of this side of Arichat Harbor, the alignment of the north side of Arichat Harbor, Petit Virat Harbor, the alignment of the shoreline that extends from Pondville up toward Cap Laurent. Those are all function of the orientation and location of those faults.
Now, one thing that struck me was you talked about some fault lines in Arichat. What's the potential there to trigger some kind of seismic activity? And are they visible? Can you actually see where those fault lines might lie?
It's a little tricky. First of all, we're not too concerned about seismicity. There is a possibility of another event like the 1929 earthquake on the Grand Banks, which had an effect in Ile-Madame. But generally, it's an area of fairly low seismicity. And as for the faults, if you find the faults are mapped by geologists by looking at discontinuities in rock. Sometimes it's just one spot a short distance from another is different, and there's a fault there. You can pick it out sometimes from the landscape for the trace of the fault. And that's what's so interesting about Ile-Madame, that the shorelines follow the lines of many of these old faults, but they're very old features. So they're not considered to be a hazard today. In the last 75,000 years, there was ice that moved in virtually every direction over Ile-Madame. But the most prominent ones were one that was to the east, the faint green arrows that you can see there. And the landforms actually demonstrate this. And one that was to the southeast. And that one to the southeast is particularly because it imprinted over the earlier one. So it's indicated by all of these drumlins, which are egg-shaped hills that are streamlined in the direction of ice movement. And ice that's moving rapidly forms these features. So they actually demonstrate where there was fast ice flow and ice, we talk about a nice stream. And there's some beautiful examples of that in Ile-Madame. So here in this lovely archipelago that we have over toward Jandron, you can see each of those dots and lines is the axis of a drumlin. And each of those drumlins, when the coast intersects it, it will begin to form a cliff. and that can then be a locus for sediment production that forms beaches to each side. And there's only so much sediment in the drumlin, so after a while it gets exhausted, like Caplarand is exhausted, and there's no more sediment coming into the system, and then this whole system can step back. Our land surface has continued to subside, and so we have had rising sea level for 11,000 years in Île Madame. It's nothing new, but if it starts to come up more rapidly, then that makes it more challenging. So we had, for example, we had this progressive, as I said, it wasn't an island, we had this progressive flooding of Île Madame, and water came in around all of these drumlins. Here is the green island I mentioned. That's apparently not its correct name. And I see I spelled Creighton Island wrong, but at any rate, you have this progressive flooding of the drumlin field with the rising sea level and all the other parts of the island. And so each of these drumlin headlands becomes a locus of sediment supply. It forms these beaches that link up to Laurier Island. Green Island, quote unquote, probably had a beach across here and a beach across here. But they stretch, and as they stretch, they need more sediment to maintain their continuity, and eventually they breach, and you end up with spits. You know, we need to think about maintaining salt marsh and other coastal systems with rising sea level. The way we do that is by allowing them to migrate upslope. And so if we have roads or other infrastructure that blocks their migration, we can end up losing them as the sea comes in, and the outer limit of the marsh migrates and the inner limit can't. It's actually called coastal squeeze, and that's one of the things that's recognized as a challenge with rising sea level.
Now, you talked about the preservation of salt marshes. How important is it that those salt marshes, and as many as possible, be preserved?
That's a really important issue. Salt marshes we talk about ecosystem services. These are things that natural systems provide either to each other or to us as humans. And so, salt marshes are incubation places for many, many species across the food chain. And they can act also as flood buffers. So in storms, having more salt marsh in front of you is a good thing. And generally they are, they're an important part of the carbon cycle. So we want to preserve the salt marshes. And if we build a road or a dike and the sea comes up, that marsh can't migrate. Its natural response would be to just keep moving up the valley. Many of our bays today are flooded valleys. There were salt marshes lower down the valley at one time. Now they're where we see them today. We want them to be able to continue to migrate to maintain that capacity to provide the services. In terms of what the projections are for Île Madame, this is some work that was done. I was involved in some of the early work on this, and colleagues on the West Coast have been leading this. So we now have projections for various scenarios for any place in Canada, around the coast of Canada. And so we can actually generate these projections for Île Madame. But so much depends on which scenario we can expect and what statistics we take. So the one on the left is for a much more modest emission scenario where we may not be facing such an increase in temperature. But if we look at the 95th percentile, the rain, within the probability, we get 80 to 100 centimeters of sea level rise. The other is for a higher emission scenario, but the median. So it's a bit complicated. Your values depend on what scenario we end up tracking. And at this point, we don't know what that scenario is going to be. So there's a tendency to say, well, we should take this upper level scenario because it could happen and be prepared for that. The other thing I mentioned that sea level is one thing to see the rise in sea level, but it's another to see the effect of that on the frequency of high waters. So this figure is a little complicated. It's called what's called a return values, an extreme values probability distribution. So across the bottom are return period in years. So this is a 1 in 50-year storm. This is a 1 in 10-year storm. This is a 1 in 100-year storm. And then the elevation, the water level elevation. And these are the highest, this is the distribution of annual maximum water levels in Halifax Harbor. Here's Hurricane Juan, which was the highest we've ever had. Prior to that, the record was a winter storm in 1967. So we look at all of these, and they tell us, what elevation, what flood level we can expect for a 1 in 50, 1 in 100-year storm. If we increase the sea level, we bring that whole curve up. And the effect of bringing that curve up is that a 1 in 50-year storm becomes a 1 in 2-year storm. That's the impact of sea level rise. It's really on that storm distribution and extreme water levels more than the average sea level. I've not heard a lot about the impact of Fiona and Neil Madame, but I imagine it was phenomenal. I would love to hear from you about that. So this is an image of the storm just offshore. The other, which comes from Ryan Snodden at the CBC, is showing the number of hours with gusts over 100 kilometers per hour from that storm. And you could see how really extensive it was. Because although it was a Category 3 hurricane just offshore that transitioned to what they call a post-tropical storm, that actually allowed it to expand. And we lost trees in Maitland, where it's just a good distance away from the center, where I didn't expect we would have that impact. Our yard was filled with trees. And you were right in the track. You were right in the track of that storm. Which you see here. And one of the effects of climate change has been that we are more frequently seeing warm water over the shelf. The Scotian shelf is increasingly warm enough to sustain hurricane energy even after the storm comes into our waters. So in the old days, tropical storms would come up. Usually they get dampened down when they got out of the Gulf Stream and onto the Scotian shelf. And that's not happening so much. So Juan actually increased as it came toward Halifax. And I don't know specifically about Fiona, but this is a diagram that's actually making the point, that the water was warm enough to sustain the energy. So what can we expect in the future? There's a lot of uncertainty about storm projections. There's still a lot that isn't fully understood. So the latest IPCC report says that the models are consistently projecting increases in the proportion of intense tropical cyclones or hurricanes. That's to say Category 4 and 5. And actually there's talk now about how perhaps there should be a Category 6. And one of the things about that most recent storm that hit, the second one that hit Florida, was it intensified from 1 to 5, I think in something like 24 hours. So that speed of intensification is also new. And then so as the coastal effects depend on the intensity, the size, the track, projected increases in sea level, average tropical cyclone intensity, and tropical cyclone rainfall rates each generally act to further elevate future storm surge and freshwater flooding. So we're expecting more. The statistics are still not really well defined.
You mentioned that the sea level rise plays a role in storm distribution. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
It's complicated to explain, but we tend to think of sea level rise of a few centimeters as being perhaps not that important. What does a 30 centimeter sea level rise do if you've got a 2-meter tide? But much of the damage that occurs along the coast and much of the energy that's expended to move sediment around happens during storms. at elevated water levels. Where we have a storm surge that raises the water well above, with the tidal prediction. And so based on that, we can estimate what today would be a storm with a probability of once in 50 years. That doesn't mean that it's going to be 50 years before we get it. It's a probability every year. It could be 1 in 50 years. But that's the average recurrence interval. And when we raise sea level, that 1 in 50 could become a 1 in 2 year, which means we're getting what today is an extreme event frequently, and we will also be getting more extreme events as well. The new 1 in 50 year event is going to be much higher. What does it mean in Ile Madame? The province, as you know, backed off on implementing the Coastal Protection Act, and they rushed into service an app, which is quite useful, but really doesn't tell us everything we need to know. So this is Nova Scotia's Coastal Hazard Mapping Tool. I encourage you to look at it. It's very instructive, and it's lovely in the sense that it makes use of the LiDAR digital elevation models that have been developed. When we were doing the sea change work in Ile Madame, one of the things we were advocating was, please get LiDAR coverage of all of Nova Scotia as soon as possible, because it has so many uses, and one of them is particularly in dealing with projecting flood levels. And so this actually has happened, and we have wonderful data. It's all available online freely at Geonova, and they make use of it in this tool. They also have a version where you can see the orthophoto images. So this is Arichat Harbor. Superimposed, you may be able to see the faint white lines there. Those are property boundaries. And the blue line is a quote unquote worst case scenarios flood level in 2100. The various issues with it, but it's nonetheless useful. That's effectively a 3-meter contour around the coast of Ile Madame. And it will tell you whether you're low or high. Problem is so then you can say we go to La Vieille Forge, and we click on that property, it will bring up this projected worst case flooding scenario here. And it has 3 components. It has a projection of the highest spring tide, and this is relative, they say relative to mean sea level. I think they mean the new geodetic vertical datum CGVD 2013, which is the new standard, which is much closer to sea level than the previous datum. So 60 centimeters above mean water level. They have a storm surge of 1 meter, which is supposed to be a 1 in 100 year storm. And remember what I told you about how the 1 in 100 can become the 1 in 2, which means that the new 1 in 100 will be much higher. I'm not sure how they've come up with this 1 meter. And then a sea level rise of 1.4 meters, which is that upper limit of the highest scenario. So that one's being very conservative. The storm surge height, I'm not sure, but it is a reasonable estimation of where if you build above that level, you're probably safe from being flooded at still water. But remember, I talked about run up, set up. You need to be above still water to be safe. Anyway, and these values don't change all around Ile Madame. So they change around the province, but for Ile Madame, it's 3 meters, the sum of these components. 3 meters is what they've used all around Ile Madame. So here's Pondville Beach. One of the things is it only comes 100 meters back from the high water line, so we know that all of this beach would be flooded in a storm that came this high. But the app doesn't show that. Here's Petit de Gras. We can see, for example, where's the, I think this is the fish plant that was flooded in a storm that happened shortly before we began the sea change work. This is Discus. And that's available. You can go online at, I'll put it back. I'll put the link is in one of the slides. I'll put it up afterward. But you can go all around Ile Madame and find, whether your property is affected by that line. So it tells you what is likely to be flooded, but it may miss some. My impression is it's missing some. And it also is not going to tell you about erosion. So it's just telling you about still water level. And then whether you'll have higher impacts depends to some extent on your exposure. So if you're, in Lennox Passage and your fetch is very limited, you may not see much wave enhancement, but on the outer coast, obviously you do. So this is where we started out at the beginning of the talk. The photo was taken looking along this shore here. And the app is telling us, for one thing, that the roads are going to be flooded. So if you want to get to this property, it's not just getting across the beach to the property, but it's getting across this bridge and this link and so on. In fact, one of the things we did with Sea Change was to map out where the road was low, and highways might want to think about raising the elevation. The other thing, as I said, it doesn't tell you about erosion. So these are two properties that have buildings on them out there. One is for sale. At least there's a for sale by owner sign, and I'm not sure which one it is. There's no link, so maybe somebody here knows. But these properties are the ones that are affected. I should mention, though, that there is significant erosion. Just it looks to me as though the road just west of the causeway here onto Jondron has been moved back. You may know that, but it certainly looks as though it's been moved back. And their private road here is close to being toast. So we just zoom in on that. This is looking at erosion rates. So this is a 2008 photo. And the red line is the cliff top line in 1953. So you can see that there's been surprisingly very little once you get into this more protected area. But something like 55 meters in 55 years at the lower big white arrow here, and a similar rate here. And as these are sort of pointed, as the erosion pushes back, the beach gets longer. And then on these two houses, the other one is 93 meters back from the cliff edge. That's a reasonable setback. But it has seen about 2.5 meters of retreat since 2008. And this other one, which is 10 meters from the edge, has also seen 2.5 meters of retreat since 2008. So I would call that one a much more precarious situation. One of the most spectacular erosional stories on Ile Madame is at Cap La Ronde. And I'm sure you've seen the pictures of it when there was a large lighthouse on top of the hill there. The map at left is actually Captain Bayfield's chart of Ile Madame that was surveyed in 1848. The map was published in 1860, but he did the survey in 1848, and it's remarkably good considering the techniques they had available to them. And we see, fairly substantial drumlin headland and this two-armed Tombolo. So Tombolo is where the beaches connect to the island, and typically it is that sort of double crescent shape. Well, nowadays this is the Nova Scotia coastal hazard map app I was showing you. So the shaded relief hillshade LiDAR survey, and you can see it's just a stub now and a single bar that comes back. So a very substantial change from 1848. Eric Force, who I mentioned earlier, was interested in this. I think he lived up somewhere in Disco's Way, Portiaville, I'm not sure, but he spent a lot of time looking at the coastal erosion there. And the black lines here are his analysis of retreat of Cap La Ronde from 1938. I think it's based on a McCaskill photo, to 1975 to 1998. And then this is the 2004 Google Earth image. It's an Airbus image, so this is today. And it's just 22 meters from the back of the hill to the cliff edge today, where it was 180 meters in 1938. So that's average since 1938, it's 158 meters or 1.8 meters per year. And since 1998, 3 meters per year. So you can also see that increase, which may or may not be, real long-term increase. But as the drumlin gets smaller, there's less and less you need to move to get rid of more.
In 100 years, it looks like there's going to be some businesses, homes, properties, roads, bridges going to be likely flooded, some in Almadam. And you said one of the needs is to kind of raise roads and to really do some preparation right now. It's inevitable that the seas are going to rise, I guess, but is it realistic to expect that these things can be done to prevent this, or at least mitigate it, I guess?
Yeah, well, I think being aware and planning, with that possibility in mind, it's one thing to remember is that we're talking about in 2100. For the flood limits that are shown in the Nova Scotia app, it's in 2100. So there is a little bit of time, but there's going to be less and less time every year, and also that flooding is not permanent inundation. So permanent inundation is the sea level coming up, but doesn't include the storm surge. So there are issues around that to be aware of. At the same time, although the projection is a fairly conservative, let's say it's a higher projection than we likely will see, nevertheless, it is entirely possible that could happen. And there are some wild cards like the West Antarctic ice sheet, which is not well understood. There's a possibility that if it goes more rapidly, or Greenland ice sheet goes more rapidly, that the projections could be actually underestimating what will happen. So there is a bit of time. If we're building something that has a life expectancy of 30 years, we don't need to build for 2100. But if we're building, roads that we expect to be serviceable, buildings that we hope will last for, 100 years or whatever, and particularly if we're building things like seniors' homes, hospitals, and that sort of thing, we need to be aware and cautious in building appropriately. Avoidance is cheaper than dealing with the effects after. So that's pretty much it. Some of the key messages are that adaptation measures that promote resilience are things we need to think about. And amongst these things that we can do are dune protection. We have not a lot of places with sand dunes on the Almadam, but Pondville's one. And anywhere you have dunes, they act as a natural buffer and can allow the beach to recover after storms. There are various things called living shoreline measures or green engineering, where you work with vegetation, usually with vegetation, but also living shorelines involve allowing the natural system to recover as it's wont to do. And there are other maintaining sediment supply to beaches. So, You know, if you build a seawall in front of one property, it actually can create erosion in the next because the sediment transport is cut off. And very often these barriers between headlands that fail are because the supply of sediment has been reduced. So finding ways to keep the sediment flowing in the system, allow it to respond more effectively to changing forcing. And then there are various legal approaches that can be taken to encourage avoidance of the hazard. And so we actually talk about coastal adaptation in terms of, one response is protection, build a wall. And if you have something like Fortress Louisbourg, you might need to build a wall and protect part of it. But that wall will need maintenance and eventually will fail. Or various kinds of adaptation like building on stilts or building higher or having a greater setback where you build. And ultimately, the best protection is to avoid building in a risk zone in the first place. So avoidance is cheaper than proactive. So proactive retreat is actually preferable to forced retreat, but avoidance is even better and cheaper. And that whatever we do, the coast is going to migrate because the sea level is changing. So erosion isn't necessarily bad. In fact, erosion can be good because it makes beaches. It generates the sediment that allows beaches to develop. It's only a problem if something is in the way. And then the other thing, as I said, it's ever changing. The coast is a dynamic interface. And so it's subject to long-term change no matter what we do.
You kind of mentioned and outlined what like governments can do, but what can people, organizations, and others do to try to prevent disaster or to try to do their part, I guess, against coastal erosion and rising seas?
Well, my sense is that we need more public awareness. If people know what some of the issues are and how to and various options for tackling them, they can either implement that themselves on their own properties, or they can advocate for a community approach that is, aware and conscious and building appropriately. So I honestly think that one of the reasons I was pleased to be here today is that public awareness is key. You need political will in order to implement some things, and that political will be there if people know and understand what they're dealing with. It's challenging. It can be expensive, but it can be even more expensive if we don't take action now. So being ahead of the curve is really where it's at, and the best way to be there is for people to understand and know the challenges they're facing.
Thank you for watching Strait Talk. Please tune in again to find out what we will be talking about.